I Survived the American Revolution, 1776, Chapter 10, page 53. It was 2 months after Lexington and Concord, June 1775, Paul began. Almost exactly 1 year ago. I marched from Connecticut to Boston with about 20 other men from my town. It took a week, 100 miles. My feet nearly fell off. They joined about 2,000 other American soldiers camped outside Boston. Boston was the headquarters for the British Army in America, Paul explained. There were 6,000 redcoats stationed there, and they'd taken over the city. The people of Boston were like prisoners. British soldiers moved into any house they wanted. There wasn't enough food. Shops were shut down. It was so bad we had to do something to get the British out. There was no American army yet, but each town in the colonies had a militia, a small group of volunteer fighters. Few of those men had ever fought in a war before. We were all just regular fellows, farmers, bakers, shopkeepers, shoemakers, sailors. Some of us didn't even know how to shoot. And this ragtag group was about to battle the most powerful army in the world. Paul and the other men knew all about the redcoats. They were experienced fighters. The British carried modern muskets, and their muskets had extra killing power, a sharp sword attached to the end, a bayonet. We heard that the British shoot first, and if you don't die from a musket ball to your gut, well, they'll finish you off with a quick stab in the heart with a bayonet. Nate flinched. The night before the battle, the Americans had been warned that thousands of British troops were on their way. Paul spent the night frantically helping to build fortifications, dirt walls, and ditches that would protect them from musket fire. We worked all night, he said, and then just after dawn the British attacked. We could hear them before we could see them, Paul said. Their battle drums make a terrible sound. Paul leaned forward. His voice dropped to a husky whisper. Rat-tat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat-tat. The hairs on the back of Nate's neck stood up. Then came the cannon explosions. British warships had sailed into the river below us and were blasting us non-stop with cannonballs. I was in one of the ditches, a trench, and somehow a big rock had gotten into my boot. I bent down to get it out, and the second I lowered my head, something huge went screaming over it. A cannonball? Nate gasped. Well, at least a 20-pounder, Paul said. It knocked my hat off. It could have taken off my head. He patted the ugly green hat next to him. I always knew this was my lucky hat. I never go anywhere without it. Paul took a deep breath. I was terrified. I just wanted to run away. But you didn't run, Nate guessed. No, Paul said. It's amazing that none of us did. We were high up on that hill, Paul went on. That's always where you want to be in a battle. On the high ground, it's easier to knock out your enemies when they're coming up a hill. And we were dug in, protected by our dirt walls and trenches. And the drums got louder. The British Army finally appeared. 4,000 redcoat soldiers marching in endless lines. They started up the hill, but we didn't shoot. Our plan? Our plan was to wait until the British were close enough to see their eyes, and then we'd all shoot at once. The British came closer and closer, and finally the order came, Fire! Crack! 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 Thousands of musket balls flew through the air. Hundreds of redcoats fell. We Americans ducked behind our defenses and reloaded. Then we fired again. Crack! 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 The redcoats sent up 3 waves of soldiers, and then the battle was over. Paul took a deep breath, like he'd been running. Nate's own heart was pounding. It took him a moment to remember that they weren't on the bloody hill outside Boston. They were in New York City, sitting together just in the grass. So you won the battle? Nate asked excitedly. No, Paul said. Wait, you lost? Nate asked, confused. Well, not really. I mean, we ran out of gunpowder. We had to retreat, escape down the back end of the hill, and we didn't free Boston, so no, we definitely didn't win. But we didn't lose either. More than 1,000 redcoats were killed or hurt that day. We lost about 300, not nearly as many as we thought we would, but there was more. And we showed that Americans are willing to fight the most powerful army in the world. We showed that we can hold our ground. As Paul kept talking, Nate realized how much he didn't know about the war. Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill had just been the beginning. The Americans had lost a big battle up in Quebec, Canada, but they beat the British in a fight down in South Carolina. And this past March, the Americans finally drove the British out of Boston. And then came the most shocking news. America wasn't part of England anymore. Not really. Just last week, on July 4th, 1776, leaders of American colonies signed a letter to King George. It had an important-sounding name, the Declaration of Independence. Our captain read it to us a few nights ago. I can't really remember the fancy words, but basically it said that the American colonies are joining together to make a brand new country, a free country, called the United States of America. That's what this war is about. We're fighting for our new country. And the biggest battle was about to happen right here in New York. Paul leaned forward. His eyes were flickering with excitement. So, you'll join us? The army? Nate asked. Now Paul had to be kidding, or crazy. Nate couldn't fight in a war. He was only 11 years old. But Paul was dead serious, and he wasn't saying Nate should be a soldier. He'd have to be at least 14 for that. I need to talk to the captain, Paul said. He's been looking for a camp helper. He'd let me stay here? Nate asked. I bet he would. Well, Nate thought of what Papa used to say when they would go stand together on the deck of his ships, looking out over the ocean. You never know what's ahead. And Papa was right. Barely a day ago, Nate had been running for his life, and now, here, he was with his oldest friend in the world. He was going to be a part of George Washington's army. Nate barely realized that he was smiling and nodding. Looks like your answer is yes, Paul said. Chapter 11, page 61. The days at the army camp started at dawn, when the drummer sounded the wake-up song. Nate chopped wood, dug trenches, and hauled water, and by the end of the day his muscles quivered like pudding. His hands were covered with bloody blisters, and at night he collapsed into his little droopy tent next to Paul's. At first, Nate felt himself under the watchful glare of Captain Marsh. He was the gruff and unsmiling head of the Connecticut 5th, Paul's army company. Captain Marsh made it clear from the start that he had doubts about hiring a boy so young. This is the army, he had told Paul, not a nursery. Nate's cheeks burned, but he was determined to prove the captain wrong. And at the end of the first week, he caught the captain watching him as he helped dig a trench under the roasting sun. Good work, son, Captain Marsh said, with the flicker of an almost smile. And Nate felt like he had won a medal. Nate missed Eliza and Theo, but he soon felt at home in the camp. The 80 men of the Connecticut 5th welcomed him. Paul hardly let Nate out of his sight, and a few of the other men kept their eyes on Nate too. The oldest of the group was Samuel. He was 53. Ancient. But he was strong and fast and the best shooter of the group. There was James, the youngest of the soldiers, and he came from a rich family. The other men made fun of the silver buckles on his boots, but James wasn't all fancy. He had the loudest burp of the bunch. He was always leaving little gifts in Nate's tent, like a pair of wool socks, a tin canteen. He even managed to get Nate a Frontier shirt, one of the tie front shirts that most of the men in the army wore with pride. Nate was happy to throw away the rough stained shirt that he'd been wearing for months. Another man who looked after Nate was Martin. He cleaned and bandaged Nate's blistered hands and patched up the holes in the bottom of his boots. Up until a few months ago, Martin had been a slave, and his owner had freed him so he could fight in the war. But that same man had refused to free Martin's wife and daughter, so now Martin hoped that his meager soldier's pay would help him save up enough to buy freedom for his family. There were a few hundred other black soldiers in the army. Many more worked in the camp. They were mostly slaves sent by their masters to dig trenches and build walls. Watching those men work gave Nate an uneasy feeling, like he had bitten into something rotten, something that he couldn't spit out or swallow. He had learned more about the Declaration of Independence, and it said that all men were created equal. Why didn't that include people like Martin's wife, or like the men digging trenches for George Washington, like Eliza and Theo? Trying to answer that question was like looking for buried treasure without a map. Nate searched his mind for an answer, but he couldn't find one anywhere. When Nate wasn't busy with his chores, he sometimes watched the men do their practice drills. They would march through the streets to the different drum songs. Those drum songs weren't for fun. In a noisy battle, the officers couldn't just shout out their orders. Their voices would be drowned out by the explosions. It was those different rat-tats that told the men which way to turn, how fast to march, when to load their muskets, and even when to shoot. When they were done marching, the men would practice loading their muskets quickly, which seemed to Nate to be the hardest part of being a soldier. One mistake and the musket could blow up your hand. The ammunition came wrapped in little paper packets called cartridges, and inside was a single musket ball and just enough gunpowder for one shot, and the men had to tear those packets open with their teeth. Boy, was it hard to get the muskets to fire right. No wonder Paul almost blew off his hand when he was learning. And of course, Nate didn't have a musket, but Samuel was determined to teach him how to load and fire one perfectly. He spent hours teaching Nate how to pour in the gunpowder. He showed him the right way to ram the musket ball down the gun's barrel. Samuel couldn't let Nate actually shoot. Gunpowder was too precious to waste on an 11-year-old. And as you can see, there are some weapons that they would use, like pistols and cannons and bayonets and tomahawk, like for the Boston Tea Party. Now, at the end of the long days, when the marching and musket practice were done, the men could relax by a camp's big fire, and these were Nate's favorite times. The men would trade battle stories, they'd show off their scars, thighs chewed up by musket balls, bellies and backs clawed by bayonets. They'd raise up their tin cups of warm water with molasses, and they'd cheer the brave leaders whose words had sparked this fight for freedom. To John Adams, to Dr. Warren, to Samuel Adams, and to Paul Revere. But they saved their loudest cheers for their commander, General George Washington. Nate saw the general often. He'd ride by the camp on his gray stallion. He was very tall and always wore an elegant blue uniform with silver buttons and a bright white sash across his chest. He looked almost kingly, and Nate thought this, but the men said he worked as hard as a common soldier. To General George Washington, the men would sing, God save the United States of America! Those cheers rang out through Nate's mind as he lay in his tent that night. But some nights, Nate woke up to a different sound. It came from his nightmares. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat-tat-tat. And on those nights, it would take a very long time for Nate to fall back asleep.